Hello and welcome to Operation Loremaster. On this episode, we'll be looking at the existence of Worgen and Goblin Death Knights. First, to understand how Worgen and Goblin Death Knights can exist, we need to understand some basic facts about Death Knights. Chief amongst those is the fact that the Death Knights that fought for the Old Horde before the end of the Second War are not the same type of Death Knights that are playable in World of Warcraft. Another quick distinction. Anytime you hear the Horde referred to as the Old or New Horde, I'm using the line of when Thrall reformed the Horde during the Third War as the distinction between what is the Old Horde, those who were cursed with the demon bloodlust, and the New Horde, consisting of the playable factions in World of Warcraft. A Death Knight prior to the Third War was a significantly different creature than the current class in World of Warcraft. The first Death Knights were raised by Gul'dan, Orgrim Doomhammer, during his rule of the Old Horde. These Death Knights were created by taking the fallen corpse of a human warrior, preferably paladins from the defense of Stormwind, but it seems any knight would do, and inserting the soul of a slain warlock from the Shadow Council into that body. The first Death Knight created in this manner was Terran Gorefiend, who could be found in the Black Temple. The reason this needs to be understood is that original Death Knights that Gul'dan created were using human bodies simply as a host, and were more fit for magic and the dark arts of necromancy than combat like a modern Death Knight is. Additionally, prior to Arthas, no Death Knight had ever been raised in any other way than Gul'dan's method, which meant every Death Knight before Arthas required both a dead human knight and a dead member of the Shadow Council, and these Death Knights were always at their core orc. That all changed when Ner'zhul became the Lich King and rose Arthas to become his champion. Arthas never truly died or lost his soul. The status of Arthas' soul can be debated as to later, once he merged with Ner'zhul to become the Lich King. But in his first incarnation as a Death Knight, Arthas was the first person to be risen as a Death Knight and allowed to keep his own soul for what it was worth. We will eventually discuss more of the backstory of Arthas or Ner'zhul, and you can easily look into their stories on WoWWiki. The reason that Arthas becoming a Death Knight is important is because it's key to how Death Knights are created from that point on. Every Death Knight Ner'zhul or Arthas rose was a soul in its own body, which is how some, such as the Ebon Order, were able to reclaim themselves and escape the Lich King's will. This will play important as to how Goblin or Worgen Death Knights can exist. The next important concept to understand about Worgen and Goblin Death Knights is to look at how the continuity of gameplay now reflects the continuity of the story in World of Warcraft. Originally, the level 1 to 60 zones were supposed to happen shortly after the end of the Third War, and primarily focus on the threats from the Black Dragon Flight and the Old God Chthon. After that followed the level 60 to 70 zones, where players ventured into the Outworlds and confronted Illidan, as well as dealt with some of the threat from the Burning Legion. It can be speculated or assumed that Death Knight events happened after the events of the Burning Crusade, and most lore references seem to imply that the fall of the Scarlet Enclave does happen after the end of the Burning Crusade content. This means that every Death Knight that ventures from Archerus does our first bit of time bending, because in order to level from 50 to 70, they must go through the Burning Crusade content, and this muddies the waters of confusion surrounding Goblin and Worgen Death Knights. When Cataclysm was released, the whole paradigm of how the leveling content went along with the timeline of Azeroth itself shifted. No longer does the level 1 to 60 content occur before the events of the Burning Crusade. They now happen after the events of Wrath of the Lich King, which means that any player who reaches level 58 and goes to the Outlands is doing a bit of time traveling until they reach level 80 and return to the Cataclysm content. While it makes the whole quest system a little harder to follow for lore purposes, it was a necessary evil for developers who had to do something about the bulk of their content becoming stale and outdated to their players. Even with the shifting timeline, it would be nigh impossible for the events of the Death Knight starting area to happen any earlier than they do in actual Azeroth time, or much later than the end of Wrath of the Lich King, because Arthas is very clearly present in the starting zone for Goblin and Worgen Death Knights. Now the simple solution to the whole question is to look at Goblins and Worgen Death Knights as ghosts in the machine, that they don't really exist from a lore standpoint, and accept them as existing only so gamers could play the new races but with the class they liked, and not exclude the Worgen and the Goblin from what was supposed to be an all-race inclusive class. but that does not really fit into a nice smooth lore version of Azeroth. In order to make Goblin and Worgen Death Knights fit into World of Warcraft lore, we'll have to be speculative, as the common answer from Blizzard is to say that a wizard did it and just accept it. So I'm going to give to you my opinionated view on how we Loremasters can fit Goblins and Worgens into the overall narrative. Goblin Death Knights are actually not a big sticking point in lore, because it's never clearly explained where Death Knights of the Archers are actually from. Only that the intent behind their creation was the destruction of the Scarlet Crusade and the Argent Dawn, as well as trying to rouse Tyrion Fordring from his exile. Judging by the wide array of Death Knights Arthas raised for his assault on the Eastern Plaguelands, it is easy to believe that he took champions wherever he could find them. Which means it could have been very easy for some of these champions to be of the Goblin race, since they would have been found rather commonly throughout all of Azeroth before the Cataclysm. The issue is that these goblins are ordered to see the Horde after the formation of the Ebon Order by Darien Morgraine. At this point of time, the goblins of the Bilgewater Cartel had not officially joined the Horde. During World of Warcraft, the goblins have been traditionally neutral, but prior to the Third War, goblins would often work with the Horde, and it is understandable that Morgraine might have assumed the Horde would be the more receptive of the two factions to a Goblin Death Knight. Worgens pose a larger issue than goblins, because feral Worgen are all that are traditionally found through Azeroth before the fall of the Grey Main Wall. We also know from the starting zone for the Worgen that the Worgen curse had not actually taken hold of the Ghanaian population prior to the end of World of Warcraft and the start of Cataclysm. So it would seem impossible that any Worgen capable of shifting between their two forms or was not feral to even exist. But there's actually a plausible reason. We know that Gilneas sent the Archmage Agrel forth during the Third War to unleash the Worgen curse upon the Scourge. After the end of the Third War, Agrel remained in Shadowfang Keep, experimenting with the Worgen curse before he was killed by the heroes of the Horde. During his conquest of Northrend, Arthas sent his blood princes to resurrect Agrel, and have him bring his Worgen to Silverbrook. We see also that these Worgen are able to shift form, and seem to be able to control their rage. It would also seem possible that the Worgen raised by Arthas at the Archers could have been from Agrel's Blood Moon pack, and not from Gilneas itself. This doesn't explain outright why Morgraine would have sent any newly created Worgen Death Knight to the Alliance. But there's actually a plausible explanation for this as well. Little was known of what was going on behind the Greymen Wall during the time between the end of the Third War and the events of Cataclysm. But it was fairly common speculation that the citizens of Gilneas had fallen victim to the Worgen curse. Morgraine may have assumed that the Alliance was more willing to accept a Worgen under the auspices that Worgen Death Knights were from Gilneas. Everyone assumed Gilneas would someday return to the Alliance, and everybody assumed that the Worgen curse had taken over Gilneas. Morgraine was right if he made these assumptions. It was only wrong about when the Worgen curse struck Gilneas. These two answers are speculative at best. They make Goblin and Worgen Death Knights fit better into the overall lore narrative, but as it stands, Blizzard has been mum about Worgen and Goblin Death Knights, since it would require likely a new version of the starting area for those two races of Death Knight. If they decided to do just so, a nice way to fit them into the narrative would be allow for Morgraine to offer fallen heroes of the fight against Deathwing's minions to be brought back to life as Death Knights to continue their fight. Of course, this won't help solve the issue of time-traveling adventures between the levels 58 to 80, but that is the nature of expansions, and it won't likely be fixed anytime soon. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Operation Loremaster. From this point on, you can look forward to one episode a week, starting Monday of every week.